I am Karin Hurt, and we're back with another episode of Asking for a Friend Live. And I am absolutely delighted today to welcome my friend, Tammy Cravit, who has been a very inspirational mentor to me in so many ways as we think about how do we move LGBTQ inclusion from a check the box mentality to an absolute integrated part of our culture. And I remember Tammy, I met Tammy online because she had read one of my probably very first blog posts back when I think only my father was reading my blog. At least that's what I thought. And she responded to this blog post and said, "Hey, Karin, your views on authenticity, I get it. It's aligned with where I am." And that began a conversation that has lasted, oh gosh, Tammy, I think we've known each other 8 years or so now. And we've worked together, had an opportunity to do some training work with you. So welcome to the show, Tammy.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, Tammy, could you just start by telling us a little bit about your journey and why this issue is so important to you?
Sure. So I am a software and internet and data professional. I've been an individual contributor. I've been a people leader. I've been a technical leader. And I've been in this space for more years than I care to admit. And I'm also a transgender woman, and I have been living as my true self for more than 2 decades. And coming of age in the transgender community when the transgender community was just sort of starting to get big and visible, I grew up in a time when there weren't really any positive role models for transgender people. The role models that you saw in the popular culture were typically, either on shows like Maury Povich or as dead sex workers on Law and Order franchise shows. That was the role models I had in the media. And so growing up with that sort of popular culture view of who we are, really, I grew up with this sense that my life didn't matter because I'm transgender. And I grew up in a world where people would see that label and that was all they would see of me, and they would stop looking at anything else. And just believing that I had so much more to offer than that. So as I've grown up and I've become successful and have had some wonderful experiences because of that success, it's really important for me to advocate and to be a visible transgender role model and advocate so that the young trans people growing up today don't have that experience. And in the course of doing that, I've learned how really important it is to talk about LGBTQ representation, LGBTQ acceptance, LGBTQ diversity, and about diversity and equality and inclusion in general. Because when we have everybody included and we have everybody having a voice, we get better results.
Thank you so much. And so the question we're really here to think about today, and I really encourage people to ask your questions in the comments here so we can have this conversation, is how do we move this diversity, equity, and inclusion from a checkbox to an integrated part of the culture? And so, Tammy, I know you know all about our MITs, your most important things. What would you say are a couple of the MITs that people who are thinking about building this into their fabric of their culture, what should they be thinking about?
Sure. Really, I think there's two most important things for me. The first one is to remember, I sort of alluded to it a minute ago, to remember that when you're talking about an LGBTQ person, they are more than just that label. I am more than just the label transgender. I have other labels that you could apply to me or that I could apply to myself. But I also have a whole lifetime of experiences and successes and failures and victories and challenges, and a whole life story that transcends just that one label. And so the first thing I think I would encourage people to remember is that when you're talking about somebody in a marginalized community, whether it's a racial minority or a gender identity, gender expression minority, or whatever it is, that that person is more than just that label. And so you can't treat this issue like a checkbox, because then you're focusing on the label and not on the people. And we want to be focusing on the people. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing that I would say is, I know a lot of people, especially in leadership roles, are afraid to have these conversations. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or making a misstep. And so the way that they deal with that is to avoid having the conversation altogether. And speaking from my own experience as somebody who has had a lot of interesting things said to me over the years, I will say that as awkward as it might be to say something uncomfortable in the moment, it's much more awkward when the people that you're dealing with and working with know that you're avoiding the conversation. So don't avoid the conversation.
Oh, I love that so much. And I have a very distinct memory with you that happened over a breakfast burrito at a gas station lobby, where we were talking and you said, hey, Karin, just ask me anything. Ask me anything. You will not offend me. And that was very liberating, because we were heading into a training, right? You were my client, and I did have a lot of questions that would help inform my ability to do work in organizations, but I really was very sensitive. What if I use the wrong pronoun? What if I screw this up? What if I say something that makes her frustrated? And you were like, just ask. And just that ask. Conversation, and gosh, Tammy, that conversation, I think was like 6 years ago, right? And I still remember that conversation. And so that was a perfect example for me of how do you just ask and say, how do we have this conversation in a way that is productive? So
absolutely.
So when you're thinking about making an environment that feels inclusive, what would you say an inclusive environment looks like? I mean, how would you describe what success looks like in this arena?
So for me, an inclusive environment, I think there's really two key parts to that. I think one part is that everybody in that environment feels that psychological safety that enables them to show up as their truest and most authentic selves and to do the best work that they're capable of. So that's one part of it, is making that environment actively, inclusively safe for everybody. And I think the other piece is remembering and recognizing that we shouldn't be trying to create a culture where everybody is the same. I've heard a lot of, especially in the high tech space, there's a lot of companies that talk about someone not being a culture fit. And what they mean so much of the time when they say so-and-so isn't a culture fit is the person saying it means so-and-so doesn't look like me, talk like me, think like me, isn't from the same country as me, doesn't have the same beliefs as me, and I want to make the culture where everybody looks like me. And why do you want to do that? Because if you could do everything, if you had the magic answers for everything, why do you need the culture? Why don't you just do everything yourself? You know, the way that we create successful and vibrant cultures and vibrant and successful companies is by including more viewpoints, more people, more perspectives, because somebody else might have the vantage point that allows them to see the critical thing that you can't see.
Thank you so much. You know, so if you're just joining us here, we are with Tammy Cravit, and we're talking about how do you move LGBTQ inclusion from a check the box mentality to actually an integrated part of your culture. And so if you have a question for Tammy, would love for you to chat that in. You know, Tammy, one of the things that I hear, behind the closed doors as people are working on their diversity and inclusion strategies, and, they say, all right, I get it, but here's the thing. I don't want to, what if I've got a lot of employees who feel really uncomfortable, and I don't want to try to make things inclusive for 1% of our organization and make 90% of our organization uncomfortable. And so if you were in that room, what would you say to someone who's having those kinds of thoughts?
I would say lean into the discomfort, because there's two realities. One reality is that 1% person that you're excluding and making them feel uncomfortable might be the person that has that critical piece of information or that critical idea that you need to be successful. And when I was in a people leadership role, I didn't want to exclude anybody's viewpoints from the room because I recognized that I didn't know everything and that I need to hear from people. And I don't want to exclude anybody that's got good ideas and can do good work. So that's one piece of that. The other piece of that is if you exclude the 1% because they're transgender or gay or lesbian, which is probably more like 20% or 10%. But you know, if you exclude that 10% and then you exclude the however many percent that are disabled, and then you exclude the however many percent that have mental health issues, and you exclude the however many percent that are of a different race or a different religion or a different skin color, and then you exclude those that are military veterans. There's so many axes of diversity that all need to be included and need to have a seat at the table, that if you start trying to exclude all of those slices of minorities because you don't want to make the majority uncomfortable, who are you left with?
Mm. Yeah, so true. So, you know, thinking about this, you know, one of the topics that always comes up in any time we're having these kinds of planning conversations, people say, but what about the bathrooms? You know, and so, you know, and I'm like, gosh, are you really? Every single time, I guarantee you that conversation comes up. So what have you been in these what about the bathrooms conversations?
I'm laughing because I've heard that comment and that question so many times. And the thing I always think about the people who say it is that they must have far more exciting things happening to them in bathrooms than I ever have. Because when I go to the bathroom, I want to go to the bathroom and do my thing and leave as quickly as I can. And I don't know what people think is happening in bathrooms, but it is an issue that always comes up. It's an issue that I have seen companies deal with very well, and I've seen companies deal with very poorly. When I myself transitioned, the company I was working for at the time said, we are deciding as a company that this is not an issue, and if anybody has a problem with it, they can come talk to us, but it's not an issue for us. I had a transgender friend who worked for another company, a software company in Silicon Valley during the first .com boom, who they made her a big red sign that said Suzanne is in the bathroom, and she had to hang it on the door of the bathroom every time that she went so that somebody who didn't want to share the bathroom with her didn't have to. And I think that's ridiculous. I think it really makes people feel othered and excluded and stigmatized. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing to do when you're trying to create a diverse and inclusive culture. But I think it's reflective of the discomfort that some people have generally around these issues. And that's the place where it shows up, because that's in the workplace, that's the place where those issues surface, and that discomfort surfaces most acutely. I will say that I think if I was giving a company advice for planning a transitioning employee, I would say the bathroom issue is not really an issue, so don't make it one.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I would say that if you're wanting to create a diverse and inclusive culture, you have to recognize that some of talking about these issues is going to create discomfort, and you have to be willing to lean into that discomfort.
Very good. So we have a question coming in from David, where he says, asking for a friend, when a leader wants to start and step into the awkward discomfort of conversations, where do you recommend they start? What questions, what conversations?
So I think really, I think that if you're trying to approach things from the standpoint of, I want to address the LGBTQ issue, you're already asking the wrong question, because what you've done now is you've shifted from focusing on the people to focusing on the label and focusing on the issue. What I recommend is to just start having conversations with all of the people who work with you and just start sharing stories. I had an incredible experience in 2018 where I got the opportunity to meet Michelle Obama. And one of the things, as anybody who's read her book knows, that she talks about a lot is she says, we all have to share our stories, because hate doesn't thrive up close. Hate doesn't thrive with the people that you have relationships with. And so I think the most important thing for a leader to want to step into those conversations is to just start building relationships and having conversations from a perspective of curiosity and sharing stories and being willing to be vulnerable and share your story.
Thank you. What would you say, because I think another area of extreme sensitivity for folks when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, in talking about any kind of inclusion here, is what do you do if you have a truly poor performer and it has absolutely nothing to do with their status, but I feel sensitive to, I can't hold them accountable. I can't manage their performance. I can't fire them because they're in this protected class. What thoughts do you have on handling that?
So I've had to deal with that a couple of times in my own career. And I think there's the local thought that I have about that one specific situation, but also it ties into that broader culture context and conversation. I personally do not want people to have different expectations of me because I happen to be transgender or because I happen to have ADHD and be autistic or whatever other things are true of other people. I want to be held to those same standards because I want to succeed. I want to excel. I want to perform well in my career. And you're not doing me or you or your company any favors by avoiding that conversation. So I would say if you have to have performance management conversations or you have to even discipline or fire people, have those conversations and just be clear that you're having this conversation because you are not performing well, rather than we're having this conversation because of who you are as a person. And so all of the things that we would normally say, like have specific examples of problems that you can talk about, point to the behavior, not the attitudes or the people. All of that stuff applies. To the larger cultural piece of that, I think it's super important. This is why it's important to not have diversity and inclusion just be a checkbox, because if you're creating that diverse and inclusive and equitable culture all of the time, then when you have to have those conversations, your team and your employees and your coworkers and your colleagues and everybody in that situation will already have that trust that you're not just making this person a representation of that label and that you're seeing them as a whole person, and that's why we're addressing their performance, is because we don't want to have different expectations of them because they fit into one of these boxes. I think that's one of the really corrosive effects of having diversity and inclusion just be a checkbox, is you don't create that trust that people are fully seen as people. And so it makes it harder when you have to hold somebody accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Oh, here we have another question from Kathryn. Have you personally been held back from a promotion due to being transgender? If so, how did you move through it and past it to grow as a person? Oh, I love this question.
I have. In fact, I've been terminated from a position for being transgender before, even though that happened to be illegal in the state that I was living in at the time. That is something I have experienced in my career. So for me, moving through it and past it was about just recognizing that being terminated or missing out on opportunity is always terrible, and you can't take it personally. I think the biggest survival skill that I have cultivated as a transgender person in the last 20 plus years in the workplace in high tech has been a certain amount of sense of humor and appreciation of the absurdity of the whole human condition and ability to laugh at myself a little bit. The other thing is that, there's that much cliched saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think the places where I've been held back, sure, it was disappointing, but those are also places and experiences that encouraged me to grow as a person, grow as an employee, grow in my skills, do better, and thrive. And the other thing, the final thing I want to say is that when I've had those experiences, they have told me something very important about the culture of the companies that allowed them to happen. And when I have a company that wants to hold me wants to terminate me or wants to hold me back from a promotion because I'm transgender, that's a company that I clearly don't have a long-term future with.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. So that leads me to my next question. So it was a perfect segue, which is, I'm sure that there are people listening who are transgender or gay or bi, who are saying, okay, that's great. I wish I worked where you do, Tammy, but that won't work here. Like, I just keep my head down. I don't bring up the conversation. I don't say anything. Maybe I'm even not even out. I just, what advice do you have for someone who is working in an environment where it does not feel psychologically safe to be who they are?
So I will say, first of all, that it's a little bit easier for me at this point in my career because I have a long track record of success. And it's definitely harder when you're earlier in your career to advocate for yourself. But I also live in a fairly conservative state. And, you know, I've been at companies that have great diversity and inclusion cultures, and I've been at companies that don't. I think the key for me has been two things. I've always been willing to build relationships. One-on-one relationship building has sort of been my career survival skill for a long time. And I've been willing to stand up and say, this isn't right. And sometimes that has cost me, but it's always been the right thing to do. When I had a wonderful opportunity, I think I mentioned earlier, to meet Michelle Obama in 2018. And she said to me, I told her a little bit of my story, and she said to me, keep being you and keep telling your story because we can't afford to go backwards. And I think really that's the key, is being willing to have those conversations and to tell our stories and to be vulnerable, because that's how we connect with people and that's how it gets better. When I was younger and sort of first out in the LGBT community, there were relatively few people who knew a transgender person who had had experiences with a transgender person or even with an LGBTQ person in general. There's a lot more of that now as more of us are out. And I think the thing is really that's really important, to connect with people and just to share your stories, because it's easy to hate the idea of a transgender person. It's a whole lot harder to hate that woman whose daughter goes to the same school as your son and who you sit on the PTA board with and who sits in the next cubicle from you at work. It's a lot easier to hate people when you see them as people, or a lot harder to hate people when you see them as people. And so for the LGBTQ folks and for other members of marginalized groups, I think being willing to share our stories and to have those conversations is really important. I said earlier that leaders need to be willing to lean into the discomfort. And I think that LGBTQ folks and other members of marginalized communities, I know it's exhausting because we get the same questions all the time. I've lost track of how many questions I've answered about bathrooms and about Caitlyn Jenner and about some of these other hot button issues. But I'm always willing to have that conversation because that's how we build relationships, and building relationships is how it gets better, and it gets better for everybody. And I have a friend who has two transgender daughters who are both preteens. And one of the things that I've said to my friend is, I'm out there sharing my story because I want the world to be better for your kids than it was for me.
Very, very good. Okay, so I just want to, before we close, if anyone has any last questions for Tammy, please type them in. And then, Tammy, you know, what final advice would you leave people with? If people are here taking notes and saying, you know, I'm in the middle of building my D&I strategy, what should they be thinking about? Anything you haven't shared yet that you'd like to leave them with?
I think I want to reiterate my one MIT from earlier, which is to always remember that you're not dealing with people of color, you're not dealing with people with mental illnesses, you're not dealing with LGBTQ people, you're dealing with people. And that's really what's important, is to be willing to remember people's humanity and to deal with them as people, and to always approach those conversations from a vantage point of curiosity and being willing to connect and be vulnerable and have the conversations and create the relationships.
Very, very nice. Well, Tammy, it has been an absolute delight as always to connect with you, to learn from you, and to have this important conversation. I know that we'll continue to be doing this as time goes on. So thanks so much for being a guest on Asking for a Friend.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Okay, so we have a beautiful lineup coming soon on Asking for a Friend. Next time on Asking for a Friend, we are going to be talking about lessons learned from lockdown. Ethel Duncan, he wrote a book called Leaders in Lockdown, and I love this book because he chronicles it as you go through time, and he's talking with very senior leaders along the way about the lessons that they learned in their experiences, and you can see how the dialogue evolves. So that will be next week's issue. So we look forward to having you join us. As always, please send in your questions for Asking for a Friend, and I will find the perfect guest. Talk to you next time.